They started with a patio, a small apartment in eastern Massachusetts, a pot of tomatoes by the window, and a dream that most people in their lives told them was ridiculous. 10 years later, they were living in a log cabin at the edge of one of the most remote wilderness regions on the planet, hunting their own food, catching their own salmon, and building everything by hand, with a YouTube channel documenting every step of it. Holdfast Alaska is the story of Amy and Dennis Westerlind, two people from the suburbs who rebuilt their lives from scratch, not once, but 3 times, until they landed somewhere that matched the size of what they had always imagined. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why that took everything they had, and why they say they wouldn't change a single decision. Neither of them had any business doing what they did. Dennis Westerlind grew up in a densely populated New England town, with no farming background, no hunting experience, and no formal survival training. His career was commercial fishing, specifically lobstering, working for his father-in-law's operation off the New England coast. Amy worked as the company secretary. Together, they lived in a small apartment in eastern Massachusetts, and on paper, their lives looked exactly like what they were. 2 suburban kids doing what suburban kids do. But something didn't fit. It had never quite fit. The dream of living off-grid, of building something from the ground up with their own hands, had been circling both of them since the early years of their marriage. Not in the vague, aspirational way that a lot of people carry big ideas without ever acting on them, but in the specific, quiet, determined way that tends to eventually produce results. They started small. Amy began growing tomatoes and vegetables in pots on their apartment patio. Not because it was practical, not because it changed anything about the life they were living, but because it was a direction. It was practice. It was proof, in miniature, that they could actually make things grow. As often as they could, the couple made the drive up to Maine. They hiked, they explored, they walked through wilderness that felt closer to what they were actually looking for. Over time, those trips stopped being vacations and started being research. They weren't sightseeing, they were learning what a different life could look like from the inside. Then they made their first move. They saved every penny they could, bought a stretch of overgrown acreage in western Maine, and got to work. No manual, no family legacy of farming to draw on. Just 2 people who had decided to learn by doing, and who understood that every skill they needed, they would have to build themselves from scratch. And here's the part that changes everything about what you just heard. The Maine homestead worked. That was the part nobody saw coming, including maybe Amy and Dennis themselves. They cleared the land, they built infrastructure. Amy trained as a herbalist, developing real expertise in plant medicine, foraging, and preservation. Dennis learned to farm, took on odd jobs, and developed the kind of practical knowledge that comes from years of doing things wrong before doing them right. The property transformed from overgrown acreage into a functioning, producing homestead. They weren't playing at this. They were building something real. What Maine gave them was more than skills. It gave them a baseline, a proof of concept. Every time someone had told them not to buy that land, and there were plenty of people who did, they had ignored the advice and pushed forward anyway. Every time the work was harder than expected, they adjusted and continued. By the time the Maine homestead was thriving, they had something more valuable than the property itself. They had evidence that they could do this, whatever this turned out to be next. Because the thing about Amy and Dennis Westerlind is that Maine was never the destination, it was the training ground. The Kenai Peninsula of Alaska had been in their conversations long before the mainland was paid off. The idea of going further, going deeper, going somewhere that actually tested everything they'd built, that idea didn't fade as life got more comfortable. It got louder. The word that Dennis used later, when talking about Maine, was familiar. Maine was good, Maine was real, but Maine still felt familiar, and familiar was no longer enough. In November 2020, they made the decision. They packed up everything. They drove 3,200 miles from their homestead in Maine to the port of Bellingham, Washington. Daughter Lena was in the back seat. The truck was loaded. The homestead they had built with years of work was behind them. And that's when the decision was made, the one nobody around her saw coming. Getting to Alaska wasn't a flight. It wasn't a road trip. It was a ferry. And the crossing was nothing like what they had planned for. From Bellingham, the Westerlinds loaded their vehicle onto a boat and prepared for the voyage north into the Pacific. The journey would take approximately 5 days. Dennis had spent years on the water as a lobsterman, so the idea of a sea crossing didn't faze him. He knew water, he knew boats, he thought he knew what to expect. He did not know what to expect. The seas that met them on that crossing measured 36 feet. Not rough, not choppy. 36 feet, towering, sustained swells that turned a 5-day boat ride into one of the most physically demanding experiences of the entire journey. For a former lobsterman to describe a sea crossing as genuinely different from anything he'd faced before, that says something. It says the Pacific, in November, off the coast heading north, is not something you prepare for with experience. You prepare for it with stubbornness. Amy and Dennis held on. Lena was secured in the back seat of their vehicle on the car deck. The family had made it through 3,000 miles of driving. They had left behind the homestead they'd built over years. They were already committed. There was no practical version of turning around. 5 days later, the ferry docked. The Westerlind family drove their vehicle off the boat and onto Alaskan soil, a place they had dreamed about, planned for, and saved toward for years, but had never actually set foot on before that moment. It was November, in Alaska. Dennis later described the adjustment, the sun barely rising above the horizon until mid-morning, then dropping back below it by early afternoon. Darkness that arrived before dinner and stayed until mid-morning the next day. It was almost smarter to get here in the wintertime, Amy said. We got the full blast right off the bat. What happened next is the reason this story spread across the internet. Their first Alaskan property was 2 acres on the outskirts of the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. For almost anyone reading that sentence, the phrase outskirts of the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge sounds extreme. It sounds remote. It sounds like the kind of place where you've left everything comfortable behind. For Amy and Dennis, it turned out to feel a little too much like Maine. They spent several years on the Kenai. They fished for salmon on the Kenai River. They hunted moose and elk on the riverbanks. They herd-shared goats. Dennis worked in the area real estate market to supplement income while the homestead developed. Amy continued her herbalism practice and built out what she knew about preservation, wild foraging, and plant medicine. They learned a traditional method for preserving Copper River salmon. Sun, smoke, and wind, no electricity required. They were doing exactly what they had come to Alaska to do. And yet, the Kenai, for all its wildness, is populated. There are roads, there are neighbors, there is a level of infrastructure and community that by any outside measure is minimal. But by the standards of what Amy and Dennis had been chasing for 15 years, it registered as familiar. Dennis put it plainly. It was a bit too crowded, too much like Maine. We were looking for a more authentic, wild Alaskan experience. There's a pattern here that's worth pausing on. Most people who make one dramatic move toward self-sufficiency stop there. They plant the flag, declare the mission accomplished, and build a life around what they've achieved. Amy and Dennis Westerlind treated the Kenai the way they had treated Maine, as a chapter, not a conclusion. In spring of 2024, they moved again. Most people who know this story stop here, but the real story starts right now. The second Alaskan move was not incremental. It was a different category of remote entirely. Amy and Dennis paid cash for a small, off-grid log cabin on 7 acres near the northern entrance of Wrangell St. Elias National Park, the largest national park in the United States, a wilderness area larger than the entire country of Switzerland, sitting in Alaska's eastern interior. Their cabin sits near the town of Slaina. Their mailing address is a P.O. box. To get supplies, they drive 17 hours to Anchorage. But the move wasn't just about remoteness. It was about a legal designation that most people outside Alaska have never encountered, the subsistence zone. Because of both the lack of state resources in their area and the extreme remoteness of their location, the Westerlinds now live in a federally drawn subsistence zone, a legally defined area where residents are permitted to harvest from the land at levels not available anywhere else in the state. Dennis explained the difference directly. On the Kenai, their family was allowed to dip net and keep 45 sockeye salmon per year. In the subsistence zone, the harvest rules shift dramatically. The species list expands to include moose, bear, porcupine, and more, with seasons and quantities designed to reflect the reality that these residents cannot simply drive to a grocery store when the hunting is slow. The subsistence designation isn't a loophole. It's an acknowledgement that some people in Alaska are actually living off the land, not just visiting it. This was the reason for the second move. Not scenery, not aesthetics. The Westerlinds moved to one of the most isolated inhabited corners of Alaska because it was the only place where the law would allow them to do what they had been working toward for over a decade, actually live off what the land could provide. Amy built A-frame chicken coops with living roofs for insulation. Dennis hunted moose and porcupine. Both of them learned what it costs, in time, in labor, in preparation, to survive a winter at the edge of a wilderness that does not accommodate mistakes. And if you think that was surprising, Stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. They launched the YouTube channel in September 2024. The way Dennis described it left no room for romanticizing. We bought a GoPro and just started taking videos of ourselves messing around on the homestead, and people took to it. No studio, no production team, no strategy deck. A GoPro, a cabin near the edge of America's largest national park, and two people who had already lived enough of a story that documenting it was almost beside the point. What separated Holdfast Alaska from the crowded homesteading content space wasn't production quality or a viral moment. It was specificity. Most homesteading channels focus on the garden, the chickens, the pantry organization, the sourdough. Holdfast Alaska documented the things that most channels can't show because most channels aren't actually living the life they're describing. 17-hour supply runs to Anchorage. Building a chicken coop with a living insulated roof. Not as a weekend project, but as a survival necessity before the temperatures dropped. Hunting moose for the freezer. Learning to wind dry salmon the way people in that region had done it long before refrigeration existed. Processing porcupine. Practicing herbal medicine in a place where a doctor is not a quick drive away. Amy articulated the mission clearly. I wanted to make the channel somewhere we could teach and help people learn to can, forage, or use herbal medicine. We wanted to give value to people who want to live a similar life, or even people who don't live this way. Providing inspiration is huge, because that's what got us started. That last line is the one worth holding on to. Inspiration is what got them started. Two people sitting in a Massachusetts apartment, growing tomatoes in pots, watching videos of other people living the life they wanted. That was the beginning of everything. The channel is, in some sense, them paying that forward. By October 2025, American Essence magazine, published through the Epoch Times, ran a full feature on the Westerlinds. Amy was active on social media into 2026. The channel carries a paid membership tier for viewers who want deeper access. Here's what the comments kept asking. And here's the answer they never got, until now. Every time a channel like Holdfast Alaska gets attention, the same conversation starts. It showed up in the comments on the Epoch Times feature. It shows up across social media whenever someone documents this kind of life. If you're running a YouTube channel and making money from it, is it really off-grid? Is it really subsistence? Are you just doing it for the attention? One commenter, identifying himself as a 46-year Alaska resident, put it bluntly. So they live off-grid and run a YouTube channel? Sounds to me like they do it for attention and get paid for it. A glorified reality TV show. It's a fair question to raise, and it deserves a direct answer. Amy and Dennis Westerlind did not move to Alaska to start a YouTube channel. The homesteading started in 2014, a decade before the channel launched. They were herd-sharing goats and working in Alaskan real estate before a single video was posted. The second move, from the Kenai to the Wrangell St. Elias interior, happened in spring of 2024. The channel launched in September 2024. 4 months later, after the move was already complete, the subsistence zone designation their family lives under is not a content angle. It is a legal classification tied to their physical address. The 17-hour supply run to Anchorage is not a dramatic storytelling device. It is the actual distance between their cabin and the nearest city. What's happening at Holdfast Alaska is not a performance of wilderness living for a camera. It's a wilderness life that now has a camera pointed at it. The difference between those two things is significant, and the channel's content reflects it. The skills are real, the food is real, the cabin is real, and the winter is real. That distinction is exactly why the audience keeps watching. In a content landscape full of staged aesthetics and curated survivalism, authenticity is the rarest resource. At this point in the story, most people walked away. What she did instead is the part nobody talks about. Amy Westerlind grew tomatoes in a pot on an apartment patio in Massachusetts. That was the beginning. The end of that sentence is a 7-acre off-grid cabin in a subsistence zone at the northern entrance of the largest national park in the United States. A trained herbalism practice, a functioning YouTube channel with a paid membership tier, and a family that has rebuilt their entire life 3 times by choice. Dennis Westerlind hauled lobster traps in New England waters for his father-in-law. That was the beginning. The end of that sentence is a man who navigated 36-foot Pacific swells to reach a place he'd never been, paid cash for a remote cabin he could survive in, and hunts moose to feed his family through an Alaskan winter. Neither of them had a background in any of this. Neither inherited land, knowledge, or money that made the journey easier than it looks. What they had was what Dennis described when people pushed back on the choices they'd made. If we had listened to everybody who told us right from the start not to move to Maine, don't buy land, don't move to Alaska, we wouldn't have done anything. We didn't listen to them, we just worked hard. If you have something you want to do, you have to do more than others are doing in order to achieve it. That's not a motivational quote, that's a description of what their actual life required. 12 years of homesteading, 3 major relocations, 5 days on a boat in 36-foot seas, 17-hour drives for groceries, winters with 4 hours of daylight, a GoPro and a YouTube channel that launched not to create a career, but to pass on what they had learned the hard way, because that was the thing that had once sent them in this direction in the first place. Holdfast Alaska is still there, still posting, still building. The story of Holdfast Alaska is not a mystery. Nothing went wrong, nobody walked away. What happened is simpler and harder than drama. 2 people from the suburbs made a decision, refused to undo it, and kept going further than anyone expected them to, including themselves. Right now, Amy and Dennis are heading into another Alaskan summer at their Slana cabin. Salmon season is coming. The work continues. For viewers who want to follow the build in real time, the channel is active, and there is a membership tier for those who want closer access to what life looks like inside a subsistence zone near Wrangell, St. Elias. Here's the question worth thinking about. Would you have made the same choices, leaving everything familiar behind, not once but 3 times, for a life that most people told you wasn't realistic? Or is there a point where the practical voice wins out? Let me know where that line is for you in the comments below.